everyone. Josan. Here to Mohan for that introduction. To Father Stephen, to Kelly Law, to Celia Tan, all those who have organized this conference. It's great to be with you in Hong Kong again. When you think about a leader, who do you think about? What face comes to your mind and your heart? Is it Nelson Mandela? Or maybe not a political leader, maybe a spiritual leader like Moses, that Tom just mentioned, David, or maybe closer to our times, Mother Teresa, Pope Francis. Who do you think of as a leader? These people are all famous, but most leaders are not famous. They are the teachers at this school who lead in the classroom. They are the pastors, the nuns, the priests, the lay people that lead the small groups in a parish. Parent is a leader. I trust that each one of you here is a leader in some way. Perhaps you have chosen to be, perhaps you don't want to be, but you are a leader in some way. This talk is for you. Can the spiritual exercises, can Ignatian spirituality give us insight into how to become a better leader? What wisdom can Ignatian spirituality, but more specifically the spiritual exercises, offer us in regard to the spirit of a good leader and the skills of a good leader? So one simple definition of a leader, at least according to the Oxford Dictionary, is a person who leads a group, an organization, or a country. That's one way of looking at it, very broad. Leadership, more specifically, is a process by which an individual influences a group of individuals to achieve a common goal. So on one hand, there's the leader. On the other hand, there's the team. And they're going towards a common point, a common goal. And that happens through communication, through interaction, through cooperation. If you've looked at the literature on leadership, it's very detailed. It's a really broad topic. So now people don't just talk about leadership, they talk about types of leadership. So for example, collective leadership, transformational, relational, servant. So just as an example, a relational leadership, from this point of view, a good leader is someone who inspires positive relationships within the team. That's the key trait from the relational leadership point of view. Servant leadership, in a nutshell, the leader doesn't focus on the goal. The main question, the goal is important, but the main question is, how do I help the members of the team to become better human beings, to become more free, more wise? So this is the key of servant leadership. How do I help the team to become better people? And in doing so, we will go towards the common goal together. So why does somebody become a leader? This fish, the red fish, is not the biggest fish. Maybe not the most intelligent fish in the group, maybe not the most attractive. What makes this fish a leader? This is just a little bit of background before we get into the Ignatian spirituality point. So one way of looking at leadership is the trait perspective. So this is the view that a good leader has one key skill that is greater than the average person. So for example, he or she is more confident, has better communication skills, problem-solving skills, greater charisma, emotional intelligence, persistence. There is truth to each one of these. The difficulty is that in the literature, there is no consensus on what is that key trait. So different studies come up with different conclusions. This is one way of looking at leadership, the trait perspective. There's also a more dynamic way, looking at what makes a good leader. And it is the process perspective. That is, it's not a static trait that a leader has or doesn't have. It looks at the interaction between the team members and the leader. There are high points and low points. It's not linear. It's, as Father Tong spoke at the beginning, it's how does this leader bring the people from one point to another point, from one state to another state, and that takes time. It's dynamic. This process perspective is open to the idea of emergent leaders. Is an emergent leader? People say there are two types of leaders. One is an assigned leader. So this person is given a title, teacher, small group leader, president. But whether or not in actuality they are a leader is a different thing. They may have this title, but do they actually help the team move closer to the goal? Maybe, but maybe not. An assigned leader. An emergent leader is different. It is a person who may or may not have a title or role, but in actuality, in reality, they are the person that influences the team the most, that actually helps them to move towards the goal. Whether they have a title or not is secondary. So this begs the question, can leaders be formed? Can the average person become a leader? 2017 study found this very clearly. There is ample empirical research, not just a little bit, ample research to illustrate that leadership is unequivocally learnable. In other words, leaders are rarely born, but they are often made. I'd like to use this as an introduction to today's talk. So what forms a leader? What makes a person into a better leader? So this study by Kunlif found that it's not necessarily a degree. A person can get an MBA degree, and that may help, but that's not the key in what forms a good leader. Noticing if this person is sensitive to what is happening around him or her. Do they observe? Are they open to noticing? Are they open to learning about self and others? Are they able to reflect on their experience, to accrue insight from this reflection? In other words, to learn from what they're reflecting on. This may sound familiar to you if you are familiar with Ignatian spirituality, but this is actually independent of Ignatian spirituality, but it's a good lead-in to what we are going to talk about today. Getting a signal to speak a bit slowly if you're receiving the translation, so I'll try my best to do that. I know that most of you are already familiar with Ignatian spirituality. It encourages a person to balance contemplation and action, to bring the relationships, the events of our daily life to Jesus in prayer, to listen to what Jesus has to say about these things, so that it affects what I do in daily life tomorrow, what I say, what I decide. It's a circle of contemplation and action. Hopefully, as this deepens, I am able to identify, to recognize Christ in the events of my daily life, not just in liturgy at Mass or in my prayer time, but in the person beside me, in the joy, in the struggles of daily life. So to do this, we need a discerning heart, to notice more clearly what in life draws me closer to God, consolation, and what in life draws me away from God, desolation. We do this by noticing, by focusing on the person of Jesus Christ, so that in life I am more attuned to his voice, and I am more and more, step by step, in love with Jesus. So I choose to spend this life, this time on earth, entering into Christ's mission, rather than doing my own work. Chinese is a very interesting language. Unfortunately, my Cantonese is very bad. But in Mandarin and Chinese, in Cantonese, there's this expression, xiao mang. Sometimes we can be very busy doing our own work. busyness is not bad, but the Lord invites us to be busy doing Jesus' work, to enter into Christ's mission. And so Ignatian spirituality invites us to do this. More specifically, today we will look at the spiritual exercises. No, has anyone here prayed the spiritual exercises in some way? Great. So you know it's a book in some way, but more profoundly, it's a retreat. 30 days of silence, or 9 months praying in your daily life. The point of this retreat is to notice where there is distance in my relationship with God. But also to notice more positively, no matter what age I am, if I'm 30 or 70, what is Jesus saying to me now? What is Jesus' will for me? What is Jesus' invitation to me now? To spend time to notice that. Then, encouraged by Christ's love, to respond to that invitation, to enter into Christ's mission. This is what leads to salvation. This is what leads to true freedom. It happens by prayer with Jesus in the Gospels, to notice how Jesus interacts with other people. What was his style of life? What was his style of speaking with his friends, with his enemies? And Jesus had enemies, so that I'm invited to imitate the Lord and to become more like him. But please don't believe me. What did Ignatius say about the spiritual exercise? This quote is from a letter that he wrote to a friend, Father Biona. He said, "The spiritual exercises are all the best that I have been able to think out, experience, and understand in this life, both for helping somebody to make the most of themselves, as also for being able to bring advantage, help, and profit to many others." Let's look at the spiritual exercises. Today we will look at these 4 points. Interacting directly with God, flexibility, looking deeper, and something called the paradox of surrender. So I hope this is a starting point. This morning, this afternoon, we will hear other voices to go even more deeply into this topic, but at least it is a start. For each of these, we will look at what the spiritual exercises have to say, and then more specifically at how it forms a good leader. So the first point is about interaction with God, interacting directly with God. Spiritual exercises say that the one giving the exercises, the director of the exercises, should act as a balance at equilibrium, without leaning to one side or to the other, should permit the creator to deal directly with the creature directly with his creator and Lord. So you may notice in the spiritual exercises, Ignatius very rarely says the director of the exercises. No, rather he says the one who gives the exercises. That is the human being there. The real director is God. The person giving the exercises, their duty is to use a colloquialism, to get out of the way, to let God speak directly to this person, not to give them a plan. So it takes great patience to do this. The heart of this is to allow the creature, the retreatant, to hear God's voice directly, to be with God directly. So one example of this, and we heard about this yesterday as well, is Ignatian contemplation. So the retreatant reads a story from the Gospel, but that's not enough. After reading the story, to enter into the scene, to become part of the story, to interact with the other characters in the scene, but more importantly, to interact with Jesus, to speak with Jesus, to eat with Jesus, to walk with him, and to let Jesus speak with you. Sometimes Jesus doesn't speak, sometimes he does something. Perhaps it's a pat on the shoulder, perhaps it's an embrace. What would it be like at the end of this year, as we come now, to tell Jesus something concretely, specifically that you are concerned about. Maybe a relationship. Maybe as you look ahead to next year, there's a pressure you're facing. What would it be like to tell him about that? What's in your heart? As you consider this issue, what do you need the most? Is it peace? Is it healing? Is it wisdom to make a decision? What do you need the most? When you express this to Jesus, does Jesus turn his back and walk away? Does Jesus want to listen to you? Is there anything he would like to say to you, do for you? This is the heart of Ignatian contemplation, a chance to interact directly with God. Ignatius presumes that we have this great grace from God, that a human being doesn't have to go through any mediator, that we can directly interact with God. I'm sure that many of you have experienced this, perhaps just even in the morning prayer, you have experienced this great grace. So if this is one aspect of Ignatian spirituality from the exercises, how does this relate to leadership? What if we took an example? Is anyone here a teacher? Perhaps at this school? Great, yes. We have the head of this school here this afternoon or this morning, we will hear him. Perhaps you are a teacher not in a formal way, perhaps in an informal way. What would you say is the role of a teacher? Really, if we had more time, I would really like to hear your voices. It makes the talk more rich. But one way of looking at the role of the teacher is to say, okay, a teacher conveys content or material to students through a lecture, or a talk, through a video. That's an important role of a teacher. But perhaps from an Ignatian point of view, from the point of view of the exercises, there's also something more profound. Teacher is someone who encourages a student to interact directly with the truth. In other words, to not just be a passive receiver of something, but to discover something for himself or herself, sometimes independently of the teacher, to interact directly with the truth. Does this make sense in some way? What if we look at an example? I invite you to look at this clip from a film, Dead Poets Society. It's a very simple clip, a short clip, interaction between a teacher and a student. Just as a little bit of background, the students had an assignment to write a poem, but this student has not done his homework. He has not written the poem. Let's see how the teacher interacts with him, and I invite you at the back of your mind to keep this idea of a student interacting with the truth.
Mr. Anderson, you're sitting there in agony. Come on, Todd, step up. Let's put you out of your misery.
I didn't do it. I didn't write a poem.
Mr. Anderson thinks that everything inside of him is worthless and embarrassing. Isn't that right, Todd? That's your worst fear. I think you're wrong. I think you have something inside of you that is worth a great deal. I sound my Eric Yelp. The rooftops of world. Uncle Walt again. Now, for those of you who don't know, a yelp is a loud cry or yell. Now, Todd, I would like you to give us a demonstration of a barbaric yelp. Come on, you can't yelp sitting down. Let's go. Come on, up. Gotta get in yelping stance. A yelp. No, not just a yelp. A barbaric yelp. Yelp. Come on, louder. Yelp. That's a mouse. Come on, louder. Yelp. We gotta go yell like that. There it is. You see, you're a barbarian and you after all. Now, You don't get away that easy. Picture of Uncle Walt up there. What does he remind you of? Don't think.
I'm a madman.
What kind of madman? Well, think about it. Just answer it.
A crazy man.
Oh, you can do better than that. Free up your mind. Use your imagination. Say the first thing that pops into your head, even if it's total gibberish.
The sweaty-toothed madman.
Good God, boy. There's a poet in you after all. There, close your eyes. Close your eyes. Close them. Now, describe what you see.
I close my eyes. And this image floats beside me.
Sweaty-toothed madman.
The sweaty-toothed madman with a stare that pounds my brain.
Oh, that's excellent. Now, give him action. Make him do something.
His hands reach out and choke me.
Wonderful.
And all the time he's mumbling.
What's he mumbling?
Mumbling truth. Truth like a blanket that always leaves your feet cold.
Forget them. Stay with the blanket. Tell me about that blanket.
You push it, stretch it, it'll never be enough. You kick at it, beat it, it'll never cover any of us. From the moment we enter crying to the moment we leave dying, it'll just cover your face as you wail and cry and scream.
In this short clip, the student begins by lacking confidence and perhaps believing he doesn't have the ability to be a poet. But notice what the teacher does. This is a bit dramatic. Perhaps in real life we can't spin a student around like this. But he asks questions and draws out that ability from the student. This is the spirit of the spiritual exercises, that the person giving the exercises draws out through questions the discovery of a retreatant's relationship with God. It already exists. The person giving the exercises invites the retreatant to notice. In Mandarin it is huan qi, to notice, to help them to bring out what is already within them. So, just as a summary, if you want somebody to know a truth, one way is to just tell them a fact. Just tell them the truth. That's one way of doing it. But another, perhaps more interesting way, is to tell that person a story and to invite that person to reflect on the story. But perhaps a deeper way is to ask that student, that person, a question, so that that student discovers the truth for himself or herself, and in that way appropriates it more deeply. But to be honest, this takes great patience on the part of the teacher, the leader, because it's risky. Maybe today the student will not arrive at that truth. It's much more convenient, it's much more expedient just to tell the truth. So it takes great courage and patience. It's risky to live like this. But if a leader chooses to live like this, they are not just conveying information about a subject. They are allowing space and time for the student to be formed as a human being. They are treating the student the same way God treats us, by giving us time and space to struggle with questions, rather than simply giving an answer. So this is one aspect of leadership, of allowing God to interact directly with a person. Just one other example of this is subsidiarity. I'm not sure if you've heard of this word. It's perhaps not commonly seen. It's very simple. It means that a task should be performed on the lowest level possible. A leader should not give undue control or interference to the team if the team is able to perform this task independently. So another way of saying it is delegation of power. Perhaps the opposite is much more commonly spoken of. Micromanagement, or a dictator, if it's for a government, a dictator that decides everything, rather than allowing the team to express their gifts and ability. So this requires training. The team needs to be trained about how to do this task. It takes time. And it is risky. The team may not succeed the first time. Maybe the leader actually can do a better job. It's a risk to allow the team to do this. But if the leader is willing to step back and allow the team to function as independently as possible, when the team arrives at that goal, that sense of achievement is much deeper. This comes from Ignatian spirituality, but it also comes from Chinese culture. You may remember Lao Tzu spoke about leadership. He said there are 4 types of leaders. The highest type of ruler is one of whose existence the people are barely aware. This is the best leader. The next best comes one whom they love and praise. Next comes one whom they fear. Next comes one whom they despise and defy. The sage, the best leader, is self-effacing and scanty of words. When his task is accomplished and things have been completed, all the people say, "We ourselves have achieved it." This is verse 17 in the 13. This is subsidiarity. But to be honest, it's not easy for a leader to do this. A leader must be clear on his or her own self-worth. Because when the team succeeds, they may receive the praise, they may receive the attention. If a leader is hungry, craving for that personal affirmation, he or she may be tempted to step to the forefront and not allow the team to express their gifts independently. So it's easy to say, but not necessarily easy to do. Just for your background information, this idea of subsidiarity has been part of the Catholic Church's social teaching for a long time. First mentioned by Pope Pius XI in 1931. Recently, Pope Francis wrote about this in Laudato Si. Subsidiarity affords people at every level freedom to develop, increases their sense of responsibility, ultimately contributes to the common good. It presumes that every person has gifts from God, so let's give people a chance to express those gifts. Let's give them a chance to interact directly with the truth, with God. So this is one aspect we'll look at today, and again, this PowerPoint, if there's one thing that strikes you today, feel free to linger with that. You don't have to absorb everything. This PowerPoint will also be made available for you, so you don't have to take notes. Another element that the spiritual exercises informs a good leader is flexibility. A person informed by the spiritual exercises leads with a flexible heart. The exercises in number 18, Ignatian says, the spiritual exercises must be adapted to the retreatant's age, education, and talent. So Ignatius adjusts, he says, the time of prayer must be adjusted. Even how many times a person prays during one day should be adjusted to that person. How long each week of the exercises, each week of the spiritual exercises, each part, how many days should be adapted to that person. He even goes as far as to say the posture, whether kneeling or sitting or standing, should be adapted for each person. He was adamant that the exercises should not be rigidly given. So does this mean that anything goes? There's no standard? No. Ignatius says that we should adjust things. The criterion is to help the retreatant attain the fruit that is proper to the matter assigned. Or in other words, to help them receive the grace of that prayer material. For example, in the first week, to help a person know, not just know that they are a sinner, but to feel sorrow in their heart for sins. If kneeling helps them to feel that sorrow, not just know to feel it, then they should kneel. And to feel, not just know, but to feel God's love for him or her. So whatever helps them attain this fruit, things should be adjusted to help them attain this fruit. So an Ignatian person influenced by Ignatian spirituality observes the fruit. What do I mean by this? Jesus says, no good tree bears bad fruit, nor again does a bad tree bear good fruit. Each tree is known by its own fruit. If you want to know whether a relationship is good, is healthy, or a project at work is good for the team, for you, look at its fruit. More specifically, Ignatius gives us this term consolation. Often it is, if something is good for us, it will give us a sense of peace in God, hope for the future, joy, courage, increase in faith, hope, love. But the most important thing is it draws us closer to God. This is the heart of consolation. It is a direction. Desolation is simply the opposite. Often it comes across as fear, anxiety, self-centeredness. But the most important part of desolation is something that draws us away from God. So notice it's not what is easy or hard, what is convenient or inconvenient, it's a direction. What draws us closer to God or away from God? Because sometimes what is good for us is not convenient. To love is not easy. So Ignatius, through the exercises, invites the person praying to notice in prayer, but also in human relationships, habits that we have in daily life, the experiences. Which of these draws us closer to God? Which of these draws us away from God? It takes time to do this. Examine is one way of doing this in daily life. I know that many of you have prayed the exercises. This may be very familiar to you. So I have a question for you. If you are also a leader, is individual consolation the same as group consolation? Is individual desolation, does it come across in the same way as a group being in desolation? You think about this. Form of consolation the same for an individual or a group? If it is different, what does it look like? So I just invite you to consider, as you lead a small group, as you lead your community, your team, maybe you have a meeting from time to time, a team meeting. Is it true that you hope that by the end of the meeting, you have not only achieved something, but people are happy? Perhaps you hope that the faces of your team members look something like this. This is the hope that you have as a leader. But sometimes do you ever find that at the end of the meeting, in reality you are the leader, but the actual faces of the team members look something more like this? Or maybe something more like this. Ignatius says, pay attention to this. What is going on here? Why are people's heads on the table? So communal desolation or group desolation has some similarities to individual desolation, but it also has some differences. Just invite you to think of the team, the people that you work with. When fear predominates the group, this is a sign of desolation. When people are competing with each other rather than moving together towards the common goal, this is a sign of desolation. When the leader talks about the future, but people keep bringing up past wounds, it's like they're stuck in old ways. They're not open to something, a new way of proceeding. This is also a kind of desolation. When people hold on to their own personal agendas rather than thinking of the needs of the group. When people are afraid to express themselves, afraid of the leader or afraid of other people in the team, this is also a kind of desolation. So we know that Ignatius says when a person is in desolation, do not make a change if possible. Notice what brought about this desolation. What was the source? What is the root? If you can, even though it is very difficult, continue to do what is good, what is right, even though it may be a great tension. Attention to whether the group is in consolation or desolation. This is one side. We know there is also communal group consolation. For example, when the team, most members are willing to listen to each other. When they may not agree, but they are willing to trust other people in the group. When they have a chance to be creative, to do something new, and to be trusted with that, even though it may fail. when people have the opportunity to express their abilities. This is mixed with subsidiarity. When there may be very many challenges, but there is also a sense of hope for the future. When there is a sense of humor present in the group, when people are willing to cooperate with each other and with God. These are signs of communal consolation. If you're more interested, Jesuit Peter Bisson and Elaine Nightingale, Goldsmith have written more about this. If the group is a consolation, thank God for this. To recharge on this blessing from the Lord and to ask the Lord what the Lord is saying to us through this time of consolation. Even if the team members aren't Christian, at least the leader can reflect upon these questions. So to pay attention to the group element, what is drawing us away from God and towards God. This is the flexibility of the Ignatian leader when he or she notices there's desolation, to make a change, to be free enough, to be flexible enough to make a change. Another element of being flexible as an Ignatian leader is to observe the ends and the means, the goal and the process that leads to that goal. More specifically, Ignatius says in 169, I must not subject and fit the ends to the means, but the means to the ends. So for example, if a person is thinking about getting married, that's great. Ignatius suggests, don't get married first, and then ask, Lord, how should the two of us serve you? First, and this takes courage, ask, Lord, do you want me to get married? Is that the best way I can give you glory? Or do you want me to live the single life? Or to become a nun or a priest? That is putting the end first, rather than choosing the means first. He talks more about this in the Principle and Foundation, number 23. Human beings are created to praise, reverence, and serve God our Lord. By this means, save their souls. This is the end. This is the mission. The other things, the means on the face of the earth, are created for human beings to help them in working towards the goal for which they are created. Jesus also talks about this. No one who puts a hand to the plow and looks back is fit for service in the kingdom of God. This is saying two things. On one hand, Jesus is saying, if you've chosen to follow me, don't look back. Don't, because of other reasons, stop following me and go back to your old lifestyle. It's kind of one point, and it's a bit negative. Don't do something. It's important. But there's also something positive Jesus is saying. When you're plowing a field, you need to look at the distant goal, at the point that will give you a standard for what is a straight line. So Jesus is also inviting a person to look at our mission, the end of this life, the ultimate goal. So if this is what Jesus says, if this is what Ignatius says in the spiritual exercises, how does this relate for a leader? How does this form a leader? I invite you to consider, as you perhaps reflect on the team that you are with, how familiar are you with the ultimate goal of this group, of the values, the vision, the mission of this group? It's easy to get caught up in the project that needs to be done today, and it's important. What would it be like to step back and look at that end goal, to look far ahead? If these are written down in some way or people know about them, do they need to be updated for this year? Is this particular project that we are doing now, is it consistent with these? What are the ways it's consistent? Is there in some way part of this project that's resisting this mission, this vision? So as an example, is the way that we implement this project, our team puts it into action, is it consistent with our values, our vision, and our mission? Because sometimes we are so focused on the goal of achieving it that we neglect human relationships. We neglect environmental concerns. We neglect other needs in our life. Look at the fruit. If this project, if the way we implement it is helping us to respect ourselves within the team, as well as the people we cooperate with, that's a sign of confirmation. But if in implementing this project, moving towards a goal, we are hurting, harming, destroying relationships, this is also something to be looked at, to make an adjustment. Is there care for the persons? Is listening a part of this process? If we do not look at that end goal, sometimes we end up a little bit like this. English used the term clutter. So on one hand, there's a lot of busyness, but it's overwhelming. There's so much there. Is there any clutter in your team or activity together? Is it possible that sometimes reducing the amount of activities, the number of activities, can help us to arrive at our mission more clearly? Sometimes doing less allows us to give a more clear witness to Jesus, but it takes courage to reduce. A person informed by these spiritual exercises is not afraid to streamline the amount of activity that we do. Another specific example of this is self-care. Does the leader, does the team take time to care for themselves, especially in physical ways, to get enough sleep, exercise, eating? Spiritually, do I have enough time for my own prayer, for my own relationship with Christ? Do I have time to do what recharges me, what allows me to get in touch with Christ's voice in my life? Do I have time for continuing education? Perhaps participating in this weekend is part of that. I think we would agree that self-care is important, but in actuality, how do we implement that? How do you care for yourself? Do you dare to rest? Do you dare to do something that allows you to recharge in the Lord, rather than to be captive by the project that is in front of you right now? And spirituality invites us to look at the end goal. What will give greater glory to God? Is it worth it to focus everything on this if it means I will burn out and not serve the Lord for a longer time period? Not an easy question. Just to review, spiritual exercises invite us to keep perspective on the values, on the vision, on the mission of this team, but also not to be afraid to look at the details, especially in human relationships. Not to get stuck in those details, but to have a balance. Administration can be something that something we don't like to do, but it helps us to keep this balance. I'm not sure if you know Ignatian, in the last years of his life, he lived in a small office. He wrote more than 6,000 letters. He was an administrator in the end of his life. Not because he couldn't go outside. He was a pilgrim. He traveled to many places in his life. But in the end, he didn't move much. He sent Xavier to Malaysia, India, Japan, China. Later on, Jesuits went to Brazil. It was because of his letters that got funds for these missions, that got permission from various leaders. He was willing to spend time doing this so that others could move out. He found this is what gave glory to God. It's not easy to look at the fruit, to know what needs to be changed and what needs to be kept the same. So just in summary for this point about flexibility, what if I'm not sure as a leader if I need to make a change or to keep something the same? Ignatian says in number 333, look at the beginning, the middle, and the end. So this relationship or this project that the team has accepted, the beginning, the middle, and most recently, as I reflect on this experience, in general, it's probably a mixture of consolation and desolation. But in general, is it drawing us closer to God or away from God? So as an example, sometimes we hear about this project, and it's very good. It will help a lot of people. But in the process, in the middle, we realize it's so consuming that we no longer have time for personal prayer. We no longer have time to accompany children or others who are sick around us. To look at not just the beginning, the middle and the end. If one of these is drawing us away from God, is it possible the leader needs to make a change in some way? It may take great courage to make that change. These will be in the PowerPoint, and we'll also have a little bit of time to reflect today. So I hope I know there's a lot of material, I hope it's not too quick. Another element the exercises encourage in formation of a leader is to look deeper, to look at patterns in life. This quote is from a recent meeting of Jesuits around the world at GC 35. Our intellectual apostolate provides an inestimable help in constructing these bridges, offering us new ways of understanding in depth the mechanisms and links among our present problems. So to spend time not just serving others, to analyze situations. This helps us to understand the nature of things, whether it's a situation in a small group, in a church, or in the world. Take time and look at the root of an issue. To discover Christ more deeply. To grow on a deeper level. This can be a bit abstract. What do we mean by this? Perhaps we can take an example from the first week of the spiritual exercises. What is the first week generally about? If you had to pick one word, what would you say? Yeah, it's about the love of God, but also honestly to look at sin in our lives. What if I were to ask you, do you remember the last time you were preparing for the sacrament of reconciliation or confession, or looking at doing an examination of conscience? Do you remember? Have you ever had this experience? When you're examining your conscience, you say, this sin, actually last month it was there as well. And actually, 3 months ago, it was there as well. Actually, 1 year ago, this same sin was there as well. You don't have to answer me, it's okay. How do you face those sins that keep coming back, that are really hard to put down? So Ignatius, in the first week, especially the third exercise, he invites the retreatant to stop counting all the leaves. It's hard to count all the leaves, all the little sins. It's good to look at them, but also to stop for a while. To look at the branches, to look at the trunk of the tree, to look at the roots. In other words, when this particular sin keeps coming up, what am I looking for when I do this sin? What am I really searching for? What am I hungry for? Is it possible that this unhealthy behavior relates to an experience from my past? Perhaps when I was lacking something, or when I was hurt in some way. Look at the trunk, a past experience. Is it possible there's something even deeper? Is there a need underlying this unhealthy behavior that is not being met right now? For example, a need for safety, for security, for affirmation, or simply to be loved. Is there a need for true friendship, authentic intimacy with another person? What is underlying this unhealthy behavior? So sometimes in the first week of the spiritual exercises, a retreatant for the first time in their life has a chance to recognize this need and bring it directly to Jesus, to ask Jesus to satisfy this need. This is an opportunity of the exercise. One more example from the exercises. This is from the second week, a meditation on the two standards. Perhaps you remember this. Ignatius invites the retreatant to recognize that in life we are on a battlefield in some way. There is the voice of evil trying to draw us away from God, but there is also Jesus' voice drawing us closer to God. We are in the middle. So to notice the ways that what is evil tries to draw us away from God. Perhaps through riches, through honor, through pride. Sometimes I like to use a more colloquial way. What if you knew someone who was more intelligent than you? And they knew everything about you. And their goal was to make you fall down. To make you go away from God. Who would they encourage you to spend time with? Where would they encourage you to go? What would they encourage you to do so that you would fall down? What would they say to you? What is that voice when you wake up that leads you to despair? Is it, you're worthless? Or look at that person. Compared to them, you're nothing. Perhaps it's, the work you're doing is useless. These people will never change. Ignatius invites us to look at the ways evil specifically tries to draw us away from God. That's only half of the story. What if there was someone who was more intelligent than you, also genuinely loved you, wants you to live out your humanity as much as possible? Jesus. What would Jesus say to you to encourage you to be more fully who you're called to be? Who would he invite you to spend time with? Where would he invite you to go? What habit would he invite you to develop in your life? What does Jesus say to you? Is it, I love you? Is it that simple? Perhaps that you are not perfect, but I will walk with you. What would it be like to write that down? Whatever it is for you, and to put it beside your bed, to let that be the first thing you see in the morning. This is what Ignatius invites the retreat to do, spiritual exercises. So what does this have to do with leadership? What would it be like to step back, to pause with your team? Because it's so hard, life is so busy. Perhaps a morning, if you have the luxury, a day, a retreat. What are the challenges you face as a team together? Rather than simply solving a challenge and moving forward, what would it be like to say, what are the challenges that keep coming up in our lives? To look at the trunk, to look at the root. Is this challenge, is this difficulty part of a pattern in our lives as we work together as a team? Is there an underlying need? If this keeps coming up, what is the need? Perhaps the need of the team, perhaps the need in the people we serve, or the society in Hong Kong. What would it be like to do this? But it takes time to answer these questions. Find time to reflect, to look at the root of the tree. In light of the two standards, how does what is evil try to distract us from our goal? And the more specifically you answer this as a team, the better. How are we drawn into squandering our time, our finances, our energy? Perhaps from another point of view, are we blinded to seeing the good we do as a team? Sometimes when we give retreats, I work with a team and we get our feedback forms back. And just naturally, we focus on the negative comments that people give, and we forget that many people write, in this retreat, I heard God's voice. In this retreat, I felt God present in my heart. What would it be like to linger in those positive points and thank God for that, to allow God to feed us, nourish us, affirm us as a team, rather than just move on? When do we feel God present together as a team? In what ways does the Lord encourage us as a team? In what words or actions? Each of these is a big question. It takes time. What is the Lord's desire, not just for me, but for our team in Hong Kong? Is it possible there is a need in Hong Kong that the Lord would ask us to help to fulfill in some way? When do we resist God? When do we cooperate with God? Each of these is a big question. If there is one thing that strikes you today, please just stay with that. There's no need to look at everything. To be honest, as we work with a team, there will be times when it is not easy. When we face failure. It is painful to have a goal and to realize we haven't reached that goal and maybe we will not reach that goal. It's painful for the leader, it's painful for the team members. And often, because teams are in a community or in public, other people notice that we have failed. So there's a social element, sometimes a stigma to that view. But to be honest, Ignatius failed. We look at the time when he was in bed and he heard God's voice and he started to think about becoming a saint. That's really important. But that came about through failure. He lost the battle at Pamplona. That's why he was in bed. But looking back later, it was a very painful time. He realized God used that failure to change his life. We look at it from a secular point of view. Jesus was a failure. He was tortured. He was killed. It's hard to fail in a deeper way. And his friends left him. But we know that that was not the end. The word brought about resurrection, new life. What would it be like to reflect together with a team? Failure. When have we failed as a team? It takes great courage to look at this. When have we suffered the most? And to give people time to express that. How does the Lord view us in those moments of suffering, of pain? Is it possible, and it may not be possible, but is it possible to discover meaning in this suffering? I know that these questions cannot be answered in 1 minute. Perhaps today my goal is just to sow some seeds, and if there's one thing that you would like to linger with, please feel free to go deeper into that. So the last point of today's talk is a paradox, the paradox of surrender. When I say paradox, I mean something that seems to be false or nonsensical, but actually it is true. It is the deeper reality. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever had an experience like this? Either personally or as a leader, there is no way forward. There is no it's very frustrating. It's not like you just have to do something and make an adjustment and you can move around. You can't see any way possible forward. Remember how you felt at that moment? Perhaps frustration, perhaps anger, perhaps something more. Sometimes at these moments, there's a voice that says, Mantai, you just push harder. Just try a little bit harder, sleep less, and you'll solve the problem. There's that voice. It's interesting. Ignatius says something a bit different. But one must keep in mind that in all that concerns the spiritual life, his progress will be in proportion to his surrender of self-love, surrender of his own will and interests. So in other words, authentic progress depends not on my own control or willpower. These are important, but it does not depend on these. Authentic progress depends on the degree to which a person surrenders to God. This is the paradox, because the world will not understand this. What does this mean? It does not mean that we become passive observers, that we let God do everything and I go home and watch TV. No. But it means that I give God the control of my life. I hand that over to God. I give God the reins. And then, when I listen to what God desires for me in this very difficult situation, I actively cooperate with what God's desire is. So I am acting, but it's in cooperation with God. It's very risky to do this, because we have no idea what God will ask us to do. I don't want to pretend that this is very simple and very easy. It's risky. It invites us to look deeper, to say that I may be a good Christian, I may be a good leader, but God is a better leader than I am. I want God to lead me and the team in this very difficult situation. This is what Jesus did. Heard this in the morning prayer. The same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself. This is the Greek term kenosis, that Jesus, when he was at the Last Supper facing the Passion, saw no way out, and he wanted the cup to pass him by. It's not that he was hungry to suffer, but he gives himself over to the Father. It takes great humility and obedience to do this, because he trusts that the Father's plan is good, is in fact the best. He admits that it is better not to control the situation, but to let God lead. So this is the paradox of surrender. When we admit our own limitations and finiteness, it's not a bad thing. We actually open ourselves to something greater, to God, something infinite that is beyond us. This is what the Jesuit theologian Karl Rahner spoke about. He spoke about a theological basis to this paradox of surrender. He said a man or a human being is insofar as he abandons himself to the absolute mystery whom we call God. If you want to be most fully human, don't control your life, abandon it to God. This is not a choice because we have no other option. Surrender to God is not an act of desperation, but rather an act of wisdom. If a leader chooses to do this, the leader lets God lead the team. But it takes great courage. Ignatius knew this very clearly. You may have heard of the Suscipe prayer. Now you know its context. So this is Ignatius's not desperate but wise decision as an older man to give himself totally to the God who loves him. Take, Lord, and receive all my liberty, my memory, my understanding, my entire will. All I have and call my own. You have given all to me. You, Lord, I return it. Everything is yours. Do with it what you will. Give me only your love and your grace, and that is enough for me. So Ignatius chooses not to control, but to step back, to let Jesus take control of the situation and his life, because he believes this is the best way forward, the most loving thing to do. So as we come to the end of this talk, there are many points, but perhaps I would like to put into practice a little bit of what I've been talking about. Not to give a detailed summary of what we've been talking about, but rather to ask you a question. So we look at what wisdom the spiritual exercises offer us regarding the spirit or skills of a good leader. We've looked at these points as a starting point. Hopefully today, this morning, this afternoon, we'll hear more about interacting directly with God, flexibility, looking deeper, noticing patterns, and this paradox of surrender. So we come to the end of this talk. What is in your heart and your mind? Is there one point or one image that strikes you? Maybe it affirms you what you're doing as a leader, as a Christian, as a person who is following Jesus. Maybe it's something that bothers you, that challenges you in some way. What would it be like to pay attention to that one point? This is enough for you. Please just stay with this. I'm just going to offer one or two more slides and then end. More specifically, if you were a leader, what is one area of my work where I can give others greater space and time to interact directly with God, where I can delegate more, allow space and time for someone to interact with the truth, with beauty, with goodness, with holiness. It may be risky. Where's one way I can experiment with this? As I reflect specifically on my team or my community, is there one moment where I experience not just personal consolation, but group, communal consolation. What was it like? What was happening that day? Jesus, what were you saying to me or this group through this consolation? What commonly distracts my team or community from living out its vision? If it's something that keeps coming up, is there a deeper need there? Do I dare to surrender myself personally, my work, my ministry to God's care and leadership? And if I don't dare, if I'm afraid of something, that's okay. Tell Jesus that you're afraid, that you're worried. These questions take time to reflect upon. Perhaps in closing, if you are willing to once again surrender yourself to God or your team, perhaps we can end by doing that together, by doing it in the way that Ignatius invites us to. So if you wish to pray this prayer together, take, Lord, and receive all my liberty, my memory, my understanding, my entire will, all I have and call my own. You have given all to me. To you, Lord, I return it. Everything is yours. Do with it what you will. Give me only love and your grace, and that is enough for me. Amen. Thank you for your attention. May the Lord bless you and the people you serve.